A black diplomat arrives at JFK Airport after a 20-hour flight, exhausted but composed, her red passport signaling not privilege, but responsibility. She's on her way to brief the United Nations on a historic peace deal. But within minutes, a security officer singles her out without cause. He forces her to open her bag, questions her legitimacy, and ignores every international protocol. But then, she pulls out something that stops him from getting a cold. A diplomatic immunity card. And what happens next not only stuns the entire terminal, it triggers a national reckoning that no one expected. Stay with me. This is a story you won't forget. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more like it. Because it was just another airport checkpoint, until the truth showed up. The airport was bright in the way hospitals are bright, clinical, unkind. The kind of light that tells you before anyone speaks that this place does not belong to you. Liberty International, they called it. But liberty is a word that lies too easily on American tongues. And for Nima Okaro, diplomat of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, daughter of Lagos, trained peacemaker of Geneva, it would be the setting not of arrival, but of reminder. Her heels clicked against the sterile floor, rhythm precise. Every gesture measured, each breath deliberate. She had not come to make an impression. She had come to report, to the United Nations, no less. But in this country, no matter your title, no matter your training, a black woman must always prepare for inspection. Her suitcase was discreet but elegant. Her passport, a deep crimson red embossed with gold, rested in her hand, visible but unspoken. She was exhausted from 20 hours in the air, but her spine was still straight. Whether tired or not, she knew how to wear dignity like armor. Behind the checkpoint glass stood a man. Not tall, not imposing, but possessed of that certain posture, a man who has decided that his uniform makes him the gatekeeper of truth. Officer Dale Mercer. You could see it in the way he squared his shoulders when he saw her, the way his fingers tensed on his belt, as if sensing a challenge that had yet to occur. Nima stepped forward. The young woman at the scanner barely looked at her documents. "You're clear," she said, waving her through. But Officer Mercer took a step. "Ma'am," he said, voice already taut with authority, "I'm going to need you to step aside." She paused. Is there a problem? Random selection. It was always random. And it was never random. Nima had been randomly selected more times in her career than she could count. In Brussels. In Johannesburg. In Washington. In cities that claimed to be global, yet still narrowed at the sight of her skin. She exhaled quietly and turned. "I am a diplomat," she said. "On urgent assignment. My credentials are in your system, and my passport." "Step aside, ma'am." The other officer, Latina, younger, eyes flickering with apology, gestured gently toward a side screening table. Naima walked, because to resist would be to give them what they were already braced for. She remembered something her father once said, "The greatest dignity is not in being seen. It is in knowing that even unseen, you remain whole." But that was harder to hold when a white man in blue latex gloves began snapping them on with the kind of pleasure that has nothing to do with protocol. He looked at her not like a person but like a problem. And the line behind her kept moving. No one questioned. Because America is full of bystanders with eyes trained not to see. This was not yet violence. But it was the soil from which violence grows. And Naima Okaro stood there, tired, dignified, disrespected, and knew this. Today, she would be forced to teach a man the very lesson her uniform had already failed to convey. The worst part wasn't that he didn't recognize her rank. It was that he didn't care. Because in this country, power rarely bows to reason, especially when it wears a black woman's face. And so it began. There are moments in life when time does not pass, it waits, heavy and still, as if watching to see what you will do. For Naima Okaro, this was one of those moments. The security checkpoint had swallowed her into its side chamber, a quiet corner made for people who are not quite trusted. The air there was colder. The silence was thick with implication. Officer Mercer followed, gloves now stretched over his hands like expectation. His movements were slow, almost ceremonial. The latex snapped with a sound that made the younger officer beside him, Martinez, her name tag said, shift her weight. Naima set her bag down on the table. Carefully, respectfully, as if it, too, might be misinterpreted. This is standard procedure, Mercer said. It always is. But standard does not mean equal, and Naima, who had spent her career mediating tribal disputes and drawing peace out of the ruins of war, knew that rituals often mask intent. In this country, the ritual of inspection had become a quiet indictment, one that never needed to name its suspicion. Open the luggage, please. She unzipped her carry-on with the same care she once used to open ceasefire proposals in Kinshasa. Inside, neatly packed clothes, a diplomatic portfolio, her toiletries sealed in transparent bags. Mercer's eyes fell on the leather case. What's that? Confidential diplomatic documents. Protected under the Vienna Convention. He looked up, lips tightening. I need to see them. You cannot. Not without clearance. There it was. The first real wall. Not of metal or concrete, but of entitlement. Mercer leaned in. When you come through this checkpoint, you're in my country. And in my country, we check everything. My country. The words hung in the air like smoke. Possession. Power. The illusion of inheritance. Naima didn't flinch. But somewhere in her bones, old fires began to stir. With respect, she said, this is not about the country. This is about protocol. Mercer didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, he took a half-step closer, enough to crowd her space without touching her. Enough to send the message that this wasn't about security anymore. It was a performance. An audience-less drama of domination. Martinez cleared her throat. Maybe we should call a supervisor. For diplomatic passengers, that's... She's resisting. Naima turned sharply. I am not resisting. I am complying within the law. But not with me, Mercer muttered, too low for anyone else to hear. And there it was, the truth. This wasn't about bags or borders. It was about the audacity of a black woman refusing to shrink. And still, Naima stood. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already survived too much to surrender her dignity now. In that moment, her silence was not submission, it was a scalpel. And it cut deep. Mercer, frustrated, turned toward the growing cluster of curious onlookers, phones now raised discreetly. His authority, once unchecked, was now being watched. And the watching, he knew, could be more dangerous than any protest. Naima's heart beat steadily. She had felt this before. In war zones. In boardrooms. In classrooms that doubted her every word. The disbelief in her competence had always arrived before she opened her mouth. But today, disbelief had a badge. And gloves. And just enough power to try to turn law into license. She raised her voice, not loud, but clear. I would like to speak to your supervisor. Immediately. A beat. Mercer blinked. Martinez, emboldened now, nodded and reached for her radio. Naima did not smile. She simply stood taller. Because in a nation that builds checkpoints around the color of your skin, even standing still is an act of resistance. It started the way these things always start, quietly. The officer raises his voice just enough to make the subject look combative. The subject remains calm, which somehow makes them appear even more suspicious. It's a dance Naima Okaro knew by heart. One misstep, not in her stride, but in their perception, and everything could turn. But the airport didn't stop. It never does. A mother cooked her baby in Spanish by the metal bins. A white businessman clicked his Rolex and muttered about meetings. Overhead, a voice called out boarding for a flight to Zurich. And still, Naima stood, a disruption not of law, but of assumption. Around her, people watched. Not openly. No one wants to be a witness. but their eyes flicked toward her. Quick, cowardly, curious. Some began filming. Because in America, the phone camera has become the new courtroom. And truth, whatever that means now, must often be proved in pixels. Officer Mercer noticed the shift too. His body grew taut. He no longer looked like a man doing his job. He looked like a man cornered by his own decision. And people like him, those taught to wear power like a second skin, don't respond well to feeling watched. He turned back to Naima. I don't care what country you're from, he said, words sharp enough to draw blood. In my checkpoint, you follow my rules. He leaned in, voice low enough to avoid recording, but loud enough to wound. You think that little red passport makes you untouchable? Naima met his eyes. It was not defiance he saw there. It was clarity. I know exactly what it means, she said, her voice a blade cloaked in velvet. Do you? Martinez, still beside them, pressed her radio. Supervisor requested it from the secondary, she said, voice trembling. Mercer shot her a glance. One that said, you've betrayed me. One that said, whose side are you on? But Martinez had heard something in Naima's tone. Not arrogance. No complaints. Just the cold, exhausted rhythm of someone who's had to explain her existence in rooms that should have already known her worth. Naima stood still, arms folded now, not in resistance, but in preservation. There is a way Black women stand when they know they are being watched not as humans, but as puzzles people feel entitled to solve. And the crowd was watching. A white man in a hoodie whispered, damn. She didn't do anything. A Black woman too rose over muttered, that's what happens when you walk like you own something. Naima heard it all. She had heard it before. Her very presence, a challenge. Her calm, a provocation. Her competence, unforgivable. At last, the supervisor arrived. A woman. Asian American. Her uniform is crisp, her gait efficient. Chin, her badge red. What's going on here? She asked, eyes sharp. Mercer straightened, standing like a boy caught cheating and unsure how to lie. Random selection. She refused to comply. Naima didn't move. I refuse to allow a breach of international protocol. I am a protected diplomat under the Vienna Convention. She held out her credentials, not to prove her innocence, but to demand recognition. Chin scanned the passport, her eyes flickering between the document and Naima's unwavering gaze. There was a pause, the kind that only matters when history is in the room. Chin lowered the document. Her voice softened. You're free to proceed, ma'am. Agent Harris from Diplomatic Security will escort you the rest of the way. Behind her, a Black man in a plain suit stepped forward. Professional. Quiet. Efficient. He had been called in by someone who still believed in order. Naima nodded, zipped her case, and began to walk. But Mercer wasn't done. His voice followed her, not in official volume, but in whispered threat. Next time, you might not have your friends to call. She stopped, turned, looked him in the eye, and then said nothing. Because sometimes silence is the loudest indictment. Because some men must learn, not through argument, but by the echo of their own voice ringing hollow in a room that no longer believes them. And so she left. But the stains stayed behind. And the story had only just begun. The car that picked up Naima Okara was black, silent, and state-sanctioned. The type of vehicle was made not for comfort, but for proof. It said, "This woman matters." And yet, only moments before, she'd been treated like an anomaly, a risk, a problem too articulate to ignore. Inside the car sat Daniel, her diplomatic aide. Nigerian-born, Harvard-trained, and, in that moment, visibly shaken. Not by what happened, but by how easily it still happened. "I called diplomatic security as soon as I saw them pull you aside," he said. "But had I not been here?" He didn't finish. Because every Black professional in America knows how that sentence ends. Naima didn't respond. She looked out the window, watching New Jersey blur into Manhattan, the skyline rising like a challenge. She had work to do, briefings, statements, negotiations about war and water and oil, but her mind remained at that checkpoint. Not because it surprised her, but because it didn't. There was an email waiting for her by the time she arrived at the Nigerian consulate. The subject line was short: follow-up on JFK incident. The sender, Ambassador Ruth Wells, the U.S. representative to the United Nations. A white woman who prided herself on progressive credentials. A donor to every cause. An ally by self-declaration. Naima opened it with the quiet hesitation of someone who already knew what it would say. Naima, I've heard about the unfortunate encounter at JFK. I am appalled and have already demanded a response from the TSA. These kinds of breakdowns are unacceptable, especially when they involve someone of your stature. Let's discuss. Ruth. Naima stared at the phrase that always follows injustice. Especially when. It was meant to comfort. It didn't. Because the implication was clear. If she hadn't been a diplomat, if she hadn't had that crimson passport, that badge of immunity, that connection, then the humiliation might have been acceptable, tolerable, expected. Racism in America often wears that soft liberal tone. It doesn't scream. It apologizes. But only after it's been caught. Later that evening, Naima sat across from Ambassador Wells in a quiet midtown restaurant where every glass shimmered with white napkins and intention. Wells leaned forward, voice low, righteous. It was an absolute overreach. I've spoken with TSA leadership. They've suspended the officer. Naima raised an eyebrow. That will not fix the problem. Wells looked taken aback. I thought you'd be relieved. I'm exhausted, Naima said, her voice sharp but not unkind. Not just from what happened, but from how often it does happen. And how you, all of you, only ever see it when it wears a uniform. Wells blinked. I'm on your side. There are no sides, Naima replied. There is just truth. And the truth is that what happened to me happens to people like me every day. Without portfolios. Without badges. Without someone waiting on the other side of the metal detectors. She paused. Tell me, Ambassador, if I were just a woman, just black, tired, and traveling, would you be appalled then? Would you have written then? Wells said nothing. Because this is what systems do. They offer sympathy when safe and silence when needed most. And yet, somewhere in that pause, something began to shift. Not guilt, but discomfort. And discomfort, Naima knew, is the beginning of change or retreat. I want to meet with the TSA, she said. Not for an apology. For reform. Wells nodded slowly. I'll arrange it. Naima stood to leave. Make sure Officer Mercer is in the room. You want him involved? Naima looked at her with a gaze that did not blink. He needs to hear the sound of his assumptions being dismantled. The meeting room smelled like coffee gone cold and compromise gone stale. It was beige and sterile, a space designed not for truth, but for containment. The ceiling tiles hummed with bureaucracy. And in the center of it all sat Naima Okaro, back straight, hands folded, eyes alert, not because she was nervous, but because she was tired of being studied like a strange specimen in a place that pretended to be civil. Across from her sat Director Phillips, head of TSA compliance. Next to him, the reluctantly suspended Officer Dale Mercer, no longer armed with a badge, but still protected by the unspoken scaffolding of power. Ambassador Wells was there too, as was a representative from the State Department, a young black man named Julian, who looked at Naima the way a son might look at a mother forced to testify for her existence. I want to begin, Director Phillips said, by acknowledging that what happened at JFK was regrettable. Regrettable, Naima echoed softly. Is that the word you use when a trained officer violates international law and humiliates a diplomat in front of dozens of witnesses? Phillips shifted in his seat. We take protocol very seriously. No, she said calmly. You take optics seriously. Protocol, you treat it like a suggestion. The room stiffened. Even Wells winced, but Naima wasn't here to make allies feel comfortable. She was here to hold a mirror up to the architecture of denial. Mercer hadn't spoken yet. His face was blank, but not unreadable. It was the face of a man calculating risk. A man who had always been told the system was his to uphold, but never taught what it was built to hide. She turned to him directly. "You saw me. You saw a black woman. Alone. Composed. And somewhere inside you, that meant danger. Not because I did anything, but because the story you've been taught about women who look like me has no space for diplomats. Only criminals. Or entertainers. Or problems." Mercer's jaw moved. He wanted to speak. Maybe even apologize. But the truth is, men like him are trained in rules, not reflection. Naima continued. "What you did to me was not exceptional. That's the problem. It was commonplace. You thought I would swallow it. Because we always do. Until we don't." There was silence. And in that silence, something began to crack, not loudly, but like ice under pressure. The kind of crack that can't be heard until the thaw is too late. Julian, the younger official, finally spoke. "Ms. O'Caro, if I may, what would real accountability look like to you?" She turned to him, not as a victim, but as a witness. "Accountability is not your suspension list," she said, glancing at Mercer. "It's your assumption list. It's the list of people you've decided are threats before they speak. It's the training manual that teaches officers how to spot a suspicious traveler without ever naming the skin tone that fills their imagination." She leaned in. "Keep Mercer in the room. But change the room." Phillips scribbled something. Wells nodded. But Naima didn't wait for their promises. Because she had learned long ago that change in America is not a revolution, it's a negotiation with its own reflection. As she stood to leave, she paused. "I have one final condition." Everyone looked up. "I want Officer Mercer to sit in on the new anti-bias training sessions. Not to supervise. To listen. And I want him to sit next to someone who looks like me. Someone who doesn't have a diplomatic passport. Someone who's been treated like I was, but didn't have the title to make it a headline." Mercer looked up, confused, maybe offended. But Naima saw something else beneath that confusion. The beginning of recognition. And for once, that was enough. The city moved beneath her feet like it always had, fast, brutal, unsentimental. Manhattan does not pause for bruises, and Naima O'Caro knew that all too well. She had walked its streets in designer heels and in silence, carrying folders filled with the futures of nations while being mistaken for staff. Not staff as in team, but staff as in service. She had just left another meeting, this one with junior officers and compliance agents. They asked her questions about bias, about perception, about de-escalation. They were polite, even eager. They took notes. But she saw it in their eyes. They didn't want to know what racism feels like. They wanted to know how to talk about it without offending anyone. They weren't learning how to see her. They were learning how to say the right things while continuing to see her through glass. That afternoon, sitting at a cafe near the UN building, she stirred her tea in silence. The sun stretched shadows across the table, and for the first time since the incident at JFK, she allowed herself to feel something heavier than anger. Weariness. There is a weariness that belongs only to those who must explain themselves to survive. A specific ache carried by those who've been asked to translate their trauma into policy reform, while still expected to smile and soften the blow. She glanced across the cafe. Two white diplomats laughed over espresso. Their badges hung around their necks like medals. Their security was assumed. Their competence was never questioned. Their presence in that cafe was unremarkable. She, on the other hand, was still being watched. Always watched. Never seen. A message buzzed on her phone. It was from Julian, the young black officer from the Reform Committee. "Ms. O'Caro, thank you for what you said yesterday. You didn't have to carry that room, but you did." It mattered. She stared at the words, then locked her phone without replying. Because the truth is, she hadn't done it for them. She had done it in spite of them. The system did not deserve her patience. But the next woman who looked like her and passed through a checkpoint with no witnesses, she did. Later that evening, Naima met with Ambassador Wells again. The press had begun sniffing around. The story was leaking. "I can handle the press," Wells said. "But the optics." Naima raised a hand. "Don't say optics to me." Wells blinked. Naima continued, voice low but firm. "Optics is what you worry about when you have the luxury of never being the subject. I don't care how this looks. I care how it lands. I care about the girls watching from Abuja, from Atlanta, from Newark, wondering if they'll ever be seen as more than a potential issue with a carry-on." Wells nodded, lips pressed together. It was not an agreement. It was recognition, still new to her. And in that moment, Naima felt the deepest truth of all. In America, a black woman must become the bridge and the burden. Expected to explain the fire while still walking through it. Expected to educate her oppressor without showing too much pain. Expected to be gracious while bleeding quietly. She didn't want applause. She wanted a day where she could be ordinary. A day where she could walk through security and be seen not as a symbol, not as a risk, not as an exception, just as a woman on her way to do her work. But America had not earned that day yet. So she kept walking. One meeting, one reform, one conversation at a time. Not because she believed the system deserved saving, but because she believed someone had to stay in the room long enough to change it. It happened just after midnight. A video, grainy but clear, surfaced online. 32 seconds of silence, tension, and violation. Naima Okaro, dignified and still, standing before a white officer in blue gloves. Her voice is calm. His posture is aggressive. And the final image, her diplomatic passport raised like a shield in a land that claims to respect law, except when it wears black skin. Within hours, it was everywhere. Cable news, Twitter, message boards swollen with fire and fantasy. Diplomat humiliated at JFK. Power trip or protocol? When security becomes supremacy. And just like that, the incident became a spectacle. Naima sat alone in her apartment, lights off, the blue flicker of television washing over her walls. The anchors debated her dignity like it was an abstract concept. They said her name with false reverence, only now that it served a headline. And outside her window, America did what it always does when caught in the act. It performed outrage. It offered condemnation without confrontation, sympathy without systems. It wrote op-eds, but refused to rewrite its playbook. By morning, her inbox was flooded. Messages from strangers, black women writing from Detroit, from Jackson, from Queens, saying, "You spoke for me." Messages from white liberals, saying, "We're horrified." Messages from politicians, saying, "This doesn't represent who we are." But it did. It absolutely did. Naima stood before the mirror and fixed her collar. She was expected to give a press statement by noon. Not just as a diplomat, but as a black woman caught in America's favorite contradiction, to be needed for your eloquence, but disbelieved in your experience. She arrived at the press room with her notes folded in her palm like scripture. As cameras flashed, she took the podium and spoke, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that leaves no room to hide. What you saw in that video was not an exception. It was the rule, finally caught in the light. I have worked for peace in places where war was carved into the landscape. And still, the sharpest cut I carry is the one that says I must prove my humanity in the country that preaches equality. The reporters didn't know where to look. Her composure was too steady. Her indictment is too calm. And America, she knew, only listens when black pain performs. So, she didn't perform. She told the truth. And then she left. Later that afternoon, she met again with Julian, the young black officer from TSA who had quietly become her ally. His face was tense, unsure. "They want to fire Mercer," he said. Naima shook her head. "That won't fix anything." Julian looked up. "The public wants someone to blame." "The public always wants blood," she replied. "But justice is not vengeance dressed in better clothes. And systems don't die when scapegoats are sacrificed. they just get smarter. There was a long silence. Then Julian asked the question she feared most. Why do you keep doing it? Staying in the room. Speaking. Teaching. Aren't you tired? Naima looked away. And then she said, almost to herself, because somewhere, some girl is watching all this and thinking it means she can't become more. And I want to be the reason she keeps trying anyway. The dust did not settle. It never does in this country, not really. America does not bury its sins. It presses them into memory, into skin, into sidewalks and checkpoints and microphones that echo with the same questions it's been asking for centuries. Who belongs? Who decides? Who pays? It had been 3 weeks since the video. The panels were done talking. The hashtags had cooled. The headlines had turned to some new outrage, some new distraction. But Naima Okaro still walked through the world with the clarity of a woman who had been both invisible and center stage. She stood now at JFK once again. Same terminal. Same gates. Same checkpoint. But this time, it was her name on the security reform documents now pinned behind the counter. It was her training video playing in the back room, not as a cautionary tale, but a curriculum. And across from her stood Officer Mercer. Still in uniform. Still guarded. But different. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. They had met once more in the final days of the review process. The air had been thick with tension, yes, but also something softer. Understanding, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. Now, face to face, he cleared his throat. I read your statement, he said. Naima nodded, waiting. I watched that clip 100 times. Couldn't believe it was me. It was, she said. And it still is. But the difference now is that you know it. Mercer didn't argue. He looked down, then back up. I'm trying. Trying. In this country, trying is both confession and resistance. And Naima had learned, long ago, not to confuse effort with absolution. But she also knew the hardest thing a man like Mercer could do was to see himself clearly and not look away. I hope you keep trying, she said. Because I'm tired of explaining. And we shouldn't have to carry both the injury and the cure. Mercer nodded. It wasn't redemption. But it was real. She walked past him then, through the metal detector, her shoulders straight. No bag pulled aside. No hands reaching for her paperwork. No glances thick with suspicion. Just the steady, surreal rhythm of being allowed to pass like any other traveler. It wasn't victory. It was reprieve. Later that week, Naima stood before the UN General Assembly, preparing to brief the Council on a peace agreement she had helped craft across oceans. No one in that room would mention the video, but every single one had seen it. She spoke with precision, with authority, with the calm of a woman who no longer needed to prove her legitimacy, only her message. And when she was done, the room rose. Not for what she had endured, but for what she had transformed. Outside, in the evening air, Julian met her with a folder. They're adding a new clause, he said, smiling slightly. Every officer who screens diplomatic personnel will now be required to review your case as part of protocol. She took the folder. Hold it. And for a moment, said nothing. Because this wasn't a solution. This was a beginning. In a world built to doubt her, Naima Okaro had carved out something rare, not safety, not perfection, but the power to be seen without shrinking. And for every girl watching, every woman who had been silenced, searched, dismissed, and denied, she had left behind a path. Not paved, but possible. And in this country, that is no small thing.